we must talk about power. When it comes to humans and to human society, it is really hard to make sense of what has happened or what is happening without looking at it through the prism of power. What is power?
Power.
Power.
Pouvoir.
Power.
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 When it comes to humans and human society in general, it is really hard to make sense of what has happened or is happening without looking at it through the prism of power. So what is the definition of power? What is power? Before I define it, I have to be very clear that I am talking about the definition of power in social sciences in the United States specifically. In this context, power is not defined or conceptualized as a position necessarily, although one generally has or one may have power. In social science in the United States, we generally think of power as a relationship with sides, dynamics, rules, etc., etc. We will talk about as much of the whole concept as we can, but it is also has to be very clear that we will not be able to address every aspect of power, every definition, every dynamic, but this way of seeing that, this perspective on power can explain a lot. So here's the definition of power in social sciences in the United States. You ready? Power is the ability to make others do what you want them to, irrespective of their desire. Let me say that again. Power is the ability to make others do what you want them to, irrespective of their desire. The operating word here is irrespective of their desire, because sometimes someone might want to do something for someone else, or sometimes someone might want to fulfill the responsibilities of the power dynamics they're in. That's not the issue. The issue is power and power dynamics work whether you want to do something or not. Meaning, for example, the power of a police officer that pulls you over to give you a driving citation is the very fact that you have to go to court and take care of that whether you want to or not. Maybe you are one of those very good citizens that wants to contribute by your driving citation or the fine that you will pay to the overall safety of highways and, this and that and the other. You might really want it to do that. That's fine. You can speed, get a ticket, and then go gleefully pay the ticket in court. However, the problem is almost none of us want to do that. Yet, the very idea and the concept and the definition of a power dynamic here is that a police officer can send a citizen into court, whether the citizen wants to or not. The same example goes, you can find the same kind of dynamic in many examples of power.
I'm also going to need you to go ahead and come in on Sunday.
So that's the definition of power. But there are characteristics that power has. For example, power always has more than one side. It can have two sides, it can have three sides, it can have many sides, it doesn't matter. But power always is a relationship between two or more entities or two or more sides. There is a side that exerts power or has the power, and then there's the side that receives the power or is being forced upon. Power has different forms: physical, cultural, economics, religious. Power has source. In terms of religious power, comes from God. Physical power comes from either the ability to hit someone or police and military. Cultural power comes, for example, from your position in a certain culture. Grandparents in some cultures have high cultural power, for example. Power also has limits, rules, laws, cultural norms. All of these rules and boundaries exist to give power a limit. Not only a limit of how far can power be applied, but also limits of who power can be applied to. For example, if a police officer pulls me over in a street and then says, if you don't do as I say, I'm gonna make sure you burn in hell, that source of power, the limit of power, who it applies to is completely broken. That's why no officer generally would say that, because they know they don't have the power. Their power is limited to traffic laws, for example, not to afterlife, as opposed to a priest who cannot tell you to go and pay your traffic ticket, but can tell you if you don't pay your traffic ticket, you're going to burn in hell. And that limit and that form and that relationship of power determines who gets to act when and how and where. So to repeat, power has sides. It's a dynamic between those who exert power and those who receive power. Power has forms. It can be physical, it can be financial, it can be legal, it can be religious. Power has source. It can be God, or again, for example, your job, your position as a judge, as a police officer, as a congressman, or whatever, as a priest. Power also has limits. There are places that powers do not apply. There are people that powers do not apply depending on the situation. And rules and policies and laws and norms are generally there to limit the power and clarify the limits of power and sides of power and forms of power. So we have to remember that. But also power has three very important rules. Okay, there are three rules that apply to what we call power. They're not in the order of importance, but the first rule of power is it is never static. Power is always dynamic. Power is always moving. It is always changing. It is always evolving. Power and those who have power always act, and they are acted upon, depending on what forms or sides or sources or limits are present, right? For example, historically, kings had power over knights, for example. Knights had power over peasants. And as we come throughout history, that changes. Then, for example, capitalists have more power than knights and generals. And then generals have more power than oligarchs, and then oligarchs have more power than the kings. And these dynamics, and then people rise up and throw a whole bunch of people out in the street and overthrow a bunch of governments, and that is when these whole power dynamics shifts in the history of humankind. And we can see that it is one of the main reasons is one of the most important rules and laws of power is that power is never static. Power is always dynamic. This kind of dynamic always exists. It exists in different sides and different levels of society. You can even see it in parent, children, police, and citizens. In any aspect you can find whatever power you are identifying, you can see it being dynamic, and you can see it shifted and changed throughout history and throughout different societies. Power is also fluid, right? It ebbs and flows. It becomes more, it becomes less. It flows through time and space and different societies. It is shaped by policies and by politics. Remember, the flow of power, who gets to have it, when, how, a lot of these is determined and affected by policies. For example, when king has a lot of power, one of the ways that that power which the king is acting on the society pushes back, creates, for example, constitutional monarchy, where there is a very specific change in the flow of power from the king to those who are representatives of people, if you will, whatever the case may be. So power and policies and politics changes the flow and the direction of power. That's what we say power is fluid. The third law of power is power begets power. When one entity has power and acts on based on that power, a lot of times it accumulates more and more and more power. Again, we can see that in king and citizen relationship, governments and citizens relationship, or whatever. You can again find many examples when the oligarch becomes I don't know, a federal employee, or a celebrity that has power of recognition becomes the president that has the power of governance, for example. And these powers, as they accumulate, the actions they take on the society becomes more drastic, more widespread, and then the action they receive, the limits, the pushback they receive also is proportional to the amount of power that is accumulated. That's why in English we have a great saying. It says, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, because power accumulates and power begets power. Now, when it comes to power and social science, there are at least 6 forms of power in any society. The first and perhaps the most drastic is physical power. Violence is the most drastic manifestation of physical power. That's why we have police. That's why police has the power to use violence in extreme circumstances in order to apply the power that is given to police by the state in order to maintain order, or a lot of times oppress people. It doesn't really matter. What is important is physical power. Most drastic be violence, execution, shooting people in a street, but then you can use arrest, torture, any kind of psychological manipulation as forms of physical violence. Anything that acts on our physical body or physical well-being, starving people, putting them in a solitary confinement. These are, again, most inhumane one being execution and shooting people, threatening people's lives, threatening taking their liberty and freedom away. These are all forms of extreme manifestations of power. The most extreme manifestation of power is physical violence or the threat of physical violence. And in this, physical violence includes psychological and mental violence as well. It is not just that somebody punches somebody in the face. Again, mental torture, any kind of torture that is both physical and mental, all of these is considered part of physical violence. It is not necessarily a relationship between government and citizens. Sometimes parents used to corporal punishment, for example, slapping, all kinds of behavior that we can see in different dynamics can be categorized as physical violence against. They might not be life-threatening. They might not end in death, but they are physical violence. It is violence, it is physical, and it is the very specific manifestation of physical power. Militaries can do the same thing. You can bomb the crap out of a city, and even if you don't kill anyone, that is considered physical violence, right? Because you've destroyed something very drastically by use of power. And, I'm sure a lot of you can think about what I'm talking about. So violence and physical power is one of the main forms of power in a society. So the first one is violence and physical force. Another form of power is political power, government, laws, bureaucracy. If you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. All of these are forms of legal power or political power. Governments have a lot of power over their citizens by the use and deployment of law. Another form of power is financial power, money, but also like corporations have a lot of power, legally have a lot of power, because they are extremely powerful financial institutions, for example. Money, interestingly, is one of the most visible manifestations of power. Basically, when we talk about, for example, wealthy people, rich people, we are generally talking about the power that comes with that amount or that form of power, the abilities that come with this form of power, recognition, access, ease of life, luxurious stuff, all material existence, all of those are money make all of those make money a very visible form of power. Culture. Another form of power in a society is culture, power of culture, power of, again, think about anything cultural from movies in Hollywood. How much power movies of Hollywood have around the world. They're popular, they make a lot of money, they're culturally recognizable. Captain America is known across the planet. But also, many of the norms, for example, many of the family norms, gender norms, all the stuff that a lot of us can go back in our memories and remember the conversations you had with your parents or your grandparents, your siblings, your friends. A lot of those conversations were very fun conversations, but a lot of it, if a authority figure was involved, you can imagine and you can remember a lot of your ideas of what is wrong, what is immoral, what is right, what a good girl or a boy should do in a society, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. A lot of what we know to be right and wrong, a lot of our identity, our personalities come from cultural, powerful figures who have shaped our childhood along with our memories and experiences and preferences, from how to use a bathroom to how to hold on to a fork to how to get married and have children and everything in between. A lot of that is conveyed to a person and shapes a person's belief system and identity and character and who they are in a society by very specific yet simple conversations. It's a person that has cultural power, but also the power of experience, the power of life, the power of wisdom, power of recognition, a lot of different things that all accumulates in what we call for example, a grandparent. Grandparents, depending on the situation, the society, the family, all that stuff, can have a lot of cultural power in lots of different human societies and cultures. The elders, grandparents, uncles and aunts have moral and social and cultural authority over children. Yes, my grandmother cannot tell a police officer, what is that you're wearing? You shouldn't wear that. Those shorts are too short. She cannot do that, but she can do that to me. She can do that to my cousins because she has the authority. So a lot of power dynamics and characteristics and behaviors that are instilled in us comes from our cultures. And a lot of times these power definitions and understandings are conveyed to us in a very friendly way. Yes, sometimes we get punished for not doing what we're supposed to, and the powers that be remind us and correct us by use of their power. Either you're grounded or you're reprimanded, you're yelled at, you're ignored, you're whatever the case may be. A power who is unhappy with one's conduct would exert the power, and the receiver responds. Either I'll be like, okay, I guess I did something bad, I'm not gonna do it, or rebel, push back on the exertion of power and be like, this is a modern world. Nobody cares what you're wearing. And that is pushing back at the power that was culturally a grandparent. But also that should show you that the power is dynamic, power changes and evolves, power is fluid, etc., etc. Another form of power in a society are ideas. Our ideas. A inventor, right? Someone who is a scientist, a philosopher, someone that a lot of people look up to, a religious figure. All of these also come with the power of ideas and the power of knowledge that a lot of people carry. And the sixth form of power is the power of numbers, right? The power of humans. When a large number of humans get together, they can do a whole lot of stuff. They can go to a stadium and cheer their teams to win. They can get into a street and topple a government. They can, I don't know, all of them can sign up for an app and make the owner of that app the richest, more powerful person in business industry. Numbers, the power of masses, is also an extremely important form of power in society. So there are six forms of power in any society: physical power, violence or anything related to that; political power, government; religious power, ideas; cultural power, cultural authorities; financial power, money; and power of masses, or the power of numbers. So these are the six forms of power in human society. But the question remains, what form of power applies to whom, when, where, why, and how? So the answer to the question of who gets to have power over who depends on who you are, meaning your identity. What is your identity? When it comes to power in social sciences, identities have a lot to do with power, power dynamics, forms of power, source of power. Identities determined the kind and amount of power a person gets in a society. So in a lot of societies, for example, a cultural power, like children don't have any power. They can't make a person do whatever they want them. But when that child grows up and becomes, for example, a married person or has children, their position of power changes because their identity has changed. They're not a child anymore. They are a parent in a society, right? For example, if you live in the United States and your identity is a gay, transgender, black person, well, you will never get a chance to run for president or be the president of the United States. I should not say never. I am hoping that will happen as soon as possible. I'm just saying that if you have a very specific identity in a very specific society, depending on what that identity is, your access to power is determined. What kind of power you have access to, how much of that power you have access to, and when can you access it. And all of these depend on our identities, how we identify ourselves and how others identify us. So this is where another very important question comes in. Then, what is identity? If identity is the main tool that is used to determine a person's access to the kind and amount of specific powers, then what is identity? And why is it that important?